Hello and welcome along to the Edie Extra channel, the place to be for podcasts about sustainability leadership with discussions with sustainability leaders. I'm Sarah, Edie's content editor, and today I'm bringing you an episode all about Scope 3 emissions, otherwise known as indirect emissions, and how businesses can measure, manage and reduce them. And doing that's a really important part of any credible climate strategy. CDP said in June 2024 that the average large listed company will generate 26 times more emissions through its supply chains than in its operations. But despite the massive opportunity to act here, fewer than 1 in 5 companies at that time had a publicly stated time-bound target to cut Scope 3 emissions in the supply chain. Setting this kind of target and delivering it can be really challenging. It can take months or even years for businesses to get to grips with that. So if you are grappling with that challenge, welcome along to this conversation with Rebecca Turner, who is the Associate Director of Carbon Services for Bureau Veritas in the UK. Rebecca, thank you so much for your time. How are you?
Hi Sarah, great to be here. Yes, very good, thank you. Looking forward to talking about Scope 3 this afternoon.
Yes, I think the biggest challenge for us will be keeping to time because Scope 3 is such a massive subject. But before we get into it, Rebecca, it would be great to hear a little bit more about yourself and your role.
Yeah, thank you. So I lead on carbon and net zero services for Bureau Veritas in the UK. And what we do is provide advice to organisations which help them to measure and reduce their emissions whilst also complying with regulation. I've worked in sustainability for just over 20 years now. So I've come from a place where I've started off with seeing organisations only reporting their Scope 1 and 2 emissions through to maybe about 10 years ago where people had introduced a little bit of Scope 3, maybe some water, waste and business travel, and then right to the point where we are today. And we've seen over the last few years where companies are looking to calculate much more comprehensive Scope 3 inventories and to engage with their supply chains as well around decarbonisation.
Great. And as you mentioned, a lot has changed and is still changing about best practice with Scope 3. But before we get into that, let's go right back to basics. So you mentioned some categories in passing there, but for listeners at the really early stage of their journey, what exactly are Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, brilliant question to start with. So they are indirect emissions and they're up and down the value chain of your business. So these are the emissions that you can influence, but you don't necessarily have direct control over. So if we look at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the internationally recognised standard for reporting emissions, it divides Scope 3 into 15 different categories. So there are quite a lot of them. I'm not going to go through what they all are today. But those 15 are defined as either upstream or downstream emissions. So to give you some examples of that, upstream emissions might be things associated with activities that feed into your business. So for example, like buying goods and services or the fuel that's used by vehicles that are making deliveries to your premises. And then the downstream emissions, those are things that are associated with activities that go kind of outwards from your business. So the use and disposal of products that you might manufacture or sell, for example, and the transport and distribution of those products as well.
Got it. And as you say, businesses didn't always focus on Scope 3. And in some cases, they're still struggling with it. But why is measuring and acting on Scope 3 emissions so important for an organisation's sustainability journey?
Yeah, so as you touched on a little bit earlier, Scope 3 emissions are going to be the vast majority of the footprint for most companies. So typically they'll be at least 70% of total emissions. I've seen them in some cases even account for over 99% of emissions. So it's a huge amount. And when companies are looking to decarbonise, what's really important to remember is if you're working towards net zero, you can't achieve that without addressing Scope 3. I do see a lot of targets out there at the moment set by companies for net zero by, say, 2030 or 2035. And then when you look at those a bit more closely, they're actually only for scope 1 and 2. So what that means is that the strategies that those companies have in place will not actually take them to net zero, and they only address quite a small proportion of the problem and therefore the risk that's associated with that. And people often might overlook or ignore or dismiss scope 3 emissions, saying, well, we can't control them. But it's important to remember as well that the influence you exert over them can be huge, really. So everything from the type of products and services that you're buying and selling, that drives what your scope 3 emissions profile looks like. So, for example, if you are manufacturing products, the waste generated by those and the disposal route that they will eventually go down are both influenced by your design stage of that product. Another example might be if you're shipping goods, do you need to use air freight or could you ship by sea? So there are lots of ways in which you can influence and reduce those emissions. What we're going to see quite soon coming actually is the importance of this influence in the second version of the SBTi's corporate net zero standard. The reason I say this is because we're expecting it to be much more focused on driving meaningful action in emissions reduction. So that'll be by adopting a scope 3 model that's based on relevance and influence rather than necessarily a certain proportion of your total emissions. Another thing that's going to become really important there as well is supply chain engagement targets. That's going to become a key area of focus, and that really reflects the importance that is starting to be recognised now around working collaboratively with suppliers to tackle emissions. And I guess the final thing I want to say here, because it wouldn't be complete without mentioning it, is regulation. So historically, scope 3 emissions have been largely ignored by regulation for the reasons that we've already talked about, but the importance of them is now starting to be recognised much more by policymakers. So some examples of this: in the UK, streamlined energy and carbon reporting hasn't mandated scope 3 reporting, but where we see newer regulations coming in like CSRD and the new UK SRS, there will eventually be mandatory requirements to report on those emissions. Some of these regulations, they're only applicable to larger organisations, but it's worth saying that they will drive action further down the supply chain because companies will be requesting data from their suppliers in order to get an accurate picture of their own emissions. And we're already seeing that with regulations like the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is now pushing importers to ask their non-EU suppliers to provide data on the emissions that are embedded in their products. So that's a good example of where we're already seeing that drive for data filtering down the supply chain.
Got it. So it sounds like there's lots of convening factors that are really pushing this up the agenda.
Absolutely. There's a lot going on.
For sure. And there's a lot going on. And as you say, it's hard to know which categories to start with or where your boundaries are even before we get to that. So if anyone's listening and they're maybe just starting out on scope 3 or they're on their journey, but they're overwhelmed at the moment, what would you advise?
So I completely sympathise. Scope 3 can be really daunting. There's a lot of categories, a huge amount of data. So I'd really just encourage anyone initially to focus on building an overview picture of which emissions categories are going to be relevant for your organisation and where the data is likely to sit. So where are you going to be able to get that from? So the first step is really starting to map out that boundary and what you need to include. I wouldn't worry too much up front about all the detail of calculations and being incredibly accurate. That can all come at a later point. When you do reach that later stage with calculations, you need to collaborate with quite a large range of stakeholders. So that might be things like procurement teams, logistics and travel teams. I would strongly advise to engage them early on to get them on board and just start to, again, gauge the data that you're going to have access to and the picture that you're going to be able to build up. And lastly, I think it's just so important to remember that this is a journey. It's not just a thing that you do once and then it's done. You do have an opportunity to build on it and to improve what you're doing. So most organizations will start out in quite a basic way and they'll go on to develop the accuracy of their reporting over time and as more data becomes available to them as well from across their supply chain. So the first step can seem really challenging, but any action that you take will help to start build a picture of your emissions, and that's the important thing.
Yeah, and if there's anything I've learned from sort of the best part of 8 years of doing what I do, it's that every business is really on a different stage of that journey, and sometimes they might need to take some steps back. But when we're looking at that, what are some shared challenges that organisations tend to run into when they start that journey? So they've probably done the stuff you've already mentioned. They've got the overview of the hotspots. They've got their likely data needs and gaps. Maybe they've done a round of calculating already. What barriers do they then commonly run into?
Yeah, so certainly there's an enormous amount of data involved, which is why that upfront mapping step that I was talking about earlier is so important to get that overview picture and to start understanding where are going to be your key areas of influence. I would say the next thing then is the availability, the type of data that you can access and its accuracy. So a lot of calculations that people do initially will be estimated or based on spend, and that's a really good starting point. And if you have no other data, I would really encourage you to do that. But it is something that you can look to improve over time. So a lot of it's just about speaking to people and looking what's out there. So speak to your top suppliers, find out whether they might calculate their own emissions and can provide you with data. Look at the products you're buying, see if product carbon footprints or EPDs have been produced for them. Even if those types of footprints and data haven't been produced for the specific product that you are maybe buying in, then they might be available for a similar product and you still might have information you can get from those that is more accurate than using spend-based data alone.
Yeah, we see a lot of organisations that are on that journey of moving from, calculating factors like spend based to more granular. And I think, as you said, it is a journey. You see
Yeah.
businesses do it over and over again, right?
Absolutely. And I think as regulations step up and there are more requirements for people to calculate emissions around products and other different things, more and more data becomes available. So it's an ever evolving picture.
For sure. So you're telling me by the time this episode airs, there'll already be more data
It's quite
going.
possible.
Got it. And I wanted to come on to essentially how people can get a little bit more bespoke help on this journey, and some of them really do benefit from that. So Bureau Veritas is probably best known for verification and certification. So how exactly are you and your team helping organisations on their Scope 3 journey?
Yeah, so as you said, we're well known for our assurance and verification services, but we also do offer lots of different advisory services. So we're working with organisations that are from all sectors, all sizes of organisations at lots of different stages in their Scope 3 journey. So some of that is helping people, maybe small organisations who are reporting these emissions for the very first time, to scope out the categories that are relevant to them and support them with their calculations. And we also help those that are a bit more advanced in their journey and maybe are doing some of the things that I was talking about before around evolving their data, wanting to improve the accuracy of the information that they're reporting and starting to work a bit on decarbonisation strategies. Another thing that we do when we're working with people who've got perhaps a large and complex Scope 3 profile or are much more advanced in that journey of calculating emissions is to offer a bespoke online solution. So we've got something called AI Track, which helps people to streamline data processing and the analysis that goes with that as well. So this draws on AI, it draws on life cycle assessment databases and combines that with the insight of our emissions reporting team to help you to identify the best available data and emissions factors for improved outcomes in terms of the accuracy of your data. What it also does is provide unique insights into emissions hotspots and the opportunity to start building a picture, profiling what some of your emissions reduction strategies might look like, swapping the order of those around, seeing what that looks like, and just helping you to develop a bit of a plan for how you're going to decarbonise.
Got it. I will say I have seen a great many businesses not try and do this alone and seek a trusted partner for this. As you said, it's really data heavy, kind of lengthy piece of work. So good to know that these options exist.
Exactly. And I think if you're investing quite a lot of time into doing this and you're really focused on driving meaningful action, it really helps to have another party involved that can help build confidence in the data and the actions that you're taking as a result.
Of course. And Rebecca, I'm looking at the clock and the time has just flown by. And we've covered a lot of ground so far, but as we come to the end of the episode, I think it's worth sort of recapping or revisiting some of the things we've talked about. So for those listening today, what would be your top takeaways for them, their sort of next steps to add to their to-do list as a result of listening to this podcast?
So I think it's really important to always reflect on the fact that you cannot achieve net zero without looking at scope 3. So it absolutely should not be something that you ignore or that you don't work to improve on. We've talked a bit about regulation, some of the things that are in place or maybe coming down the line. So those may be drivers for your business in the future, but also I think just to point out that stakeholders are already watching what you're doing. So whether you're impacted directly by legislation or not, requirements to report on these emissions are going to filter down to you, whether that's through requests from your customers or your investors. So do take action. And I think then it's if you haven't done anything already, do take the first steps to map out the emissions, reach out to your data providers and your suppliers for conversations. Even if you've already made a start, keep doing that periodically, see how you can build on that picture, improve the accuracy of your data and the insights that you're getting from it, see who you can talk to about decarbonisation approaches. And you might be quite pleasantly surprised at the information that's already available. And who knows, it could be easier than you think to get started.
Right, I think it's nice to end on that positive note when there just seems to be such a big to-do list.
Absolutely.
Got it. Rebecca, thank you so much for your time for coming on ED Extra. That is about all of the time we have for this episode. But for anyone listening, if you'd like to access more information on any of the services that Rebecca has mentioned today, including AI Track, you can visit the Bureau Veritas website. But for this episode, that is everything. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you and goodbye.